I was presenting here last year on HUSTEF also. I remember at end of October. And shortly after that, I decided to visit my parents and my brother back home to meet them before Christmas once more and to have a beer, 1 or 2 beers with my brother there. And shortly after I arrived and I told my plans to my brother, he said that he do not want to drink with me. He said he's feeling a bit sick and probably got cold, and therefore he wants to skip the beer. So we just talked. We also made a photo together that time, and unfortunately, this is our last photo together. And this was the last time we talked together. Because in 2 weeks, he got really sick, got in a hospital, and in another 2 weeks, he passed away. This was a really hard lesson for me to understand the real impacts of a risk. There was absolutely no sign that my brother has a serious disease. But his doctor said that if he would have taken a medical screening with a blood sample at least once in the last 8 years, he could be still alive. We easily ignore those risks which are very unlikely, don't we? And we are doing similarly in software industry. We ignore those risks which are very unlikely to happen, which has low probability. And the topic I would like to present you today, risk-based testing, is such a technique which can help you to focus more on those critical risks and critical parts of your software which have to be handled before they do some damage, before it's too late. So how we met with risk-based testing. I was a developer, an architect, and I heard about risk-based testing before. But when we started was with our agile transition 3 years ago. So after switching to agile, we faced the same issues that many other teams faces. That we are expected to deliver high-quality user stories, possible shippable product, but we didn't really know how. So we put testers in the Scrum teams, but we fall back, we used those techniques which we already knew. So we started with some design, then we did some implementation, and at the end we did some testing. So like a mini waterfall in a sprint. And this has actually the same problems than the usual V model. If we find any serious issue, any critical issue during the testing, it's usually too late to change anything. So if their code is there, we cannot change it easily. And therefore, if we find any critical issues, then we have to live with the consequences. We will have to live with bugs, with technical debts. This means we do some hacking behind, or we have some other limitations. Probably we have to cut out features or remove some parts of the feature. It's not good. And yesterday I already heard about a shift left movement here at HUSTEF, and there will be talk about that. And this is what we talked about also 3 years ago. How cool it would be if we could find those critical parts already before the implementation is started. So we can do the testing part before anything is there. And this is where risk-based testing came into play. So the usual risk-based testing is a bit different. So you can use to prioritize risk or test cases which has the most value for a limited time frame or something like that. We are using the concepts of risk-based testing in an agile team together with development. And I would like to show exactly how we are doing this. So for this, I put together a process we use. And the good news is that you can use the elements of this risk-based testing in almost any process. So if you are using a different approach, you can still use it. It's quite easy. Okay, so what are our process? I have 4 phases. The first one is the preparation phase, where the product owner brings a story to the team. This is already, or still rough, it's not complete. We might have some acceptance criteria, but it can be extended. So we are doing some clarifications in the story. The next phase is when the user story is ready, defined with acceptance criteria, and the team sits together to find a technical solution for it. So this is where the grooming meeting happens, and they do story pointing and so on. The next one is the planning, where they define the concrete tasks which needs to be done in order to complete, to fulfill the story. And the last part is the sprint, where these tasks are really done and completed. So let's see how the risk-based testing concepts fits in this process. At the beginning, the product owner brings a new user story, and right at this moment, after this moment, the team can sit together to have a risk-based test meeting. So another meeting, yeah. There are some tricks to do this, because there are some dangers also behind. So first, on this risk-based test meeting, it's not needed that every team member is there. So if you can say something to the story, or you can say relevant things, then you should be there, but otherwise not. So those are invited who are interested or can say something. Another important thing with this is that we are collecting risks related to the user story, to this specific user story. We are not collecting risk for the product or for the project, for the whole project. So it's not about that our key developer will leave the company and what happens then. They are risks related to this user story, concretely what can go wrong. What dangers lies in this user story, and not other features, but we should consider the combination of features. So what are the consequences if I use this feature with combination with other features? Are there any risks inside? Could be any problems behind? Another important part in this meeting, that we need to involve some experts. And here we found a really, really good practice. As you might heard before, here at Avasoft we have a separate system test. It's a whole separate department. But we managed to involve them in this risk-based test meeting which we have in Scrum teams, where the development happens. So we are inviting them as experts for this story long before the implementation starts. And this has huge benefits for both sides. From our side, from development side, it's really, really good to see or to get those insights, those experience what the system test colleague has. So they have always relevant risk and relevant notes for the meeting. And from the other side, for the system test colleagues, it's really motivating, I suppose, that they are involved in this definition phase of the story, and they can have an impact of the story. And not through bugs, through finding bugs later, but avoiding bugs. And I know you like finding bugs, but I suppose that avoiding it is much better. I hope. So the most important part of the process was this meeting. So anything after that is just optional. It's not so important, but there are still some value in it. So here we have a basic list of risks for the user story, which already can be used to focus on the critical parts of the software. But it can be helpful also in the later phases. So when the team sits together to find a technical solution and they do some story pointing, they can use the risk table to find out the critical parts of the story. What are the most problematic issues in this story? So what they need to focus on. And for that we can use the classic approach to prioritize the risks. So we set a probability, a damage, and also as a third number, a test effectiveness. This means that how easy is to test these risks. This can be quite easy to do some automated testing, or it can be almost impossible. And with this, we can have a prioritized risk list. And as I said, this is optional. So if it helps you, so if you want to start with this technique, I recommend that you try to collect the risks first and then try to do this prioritization. But if it do not help you, then you always test every risk anyway. You don't need to do it. It's really optional. But in the planning meeting where we define the tasks, this prioritized risk table is really helpful to define a test strategy already. We are still before the implementation. And this is that we have the most critical risks at the top of the table. And we can define already test cases for that. And this means a really big change for development perspective. That we are not focusing on the happy day pass. What happens when everything goes right? But we are focusing on some special issues where something can go wrong. And we have really valuable test cases which focus on critical issues. Of course, the happy day pass is somewhere in there, but there are also problematic parts there. And from the other hand, because we have a focus on critical issues, we can easily avoid it. So the developers know what problems can be behind a feature. And then it's quite easy. At the beginning of the sprint, we have a defined test case list, which we can discuss also with the system test colleagues, and then we do the implementation. And everyone knows what to do and what needs to be done. So then, hopefully, we have a successful demo. So this is our process. It's really, really simple, actually, in real life. And the teams who are using it, and more teams are start using it, the teams who are using it for more years, they still like it. And I think one of the reasons is because this is optional. The whole risk-based testing in our project is not mandatory. So if they do not like it, they don't have to use it. But they have to deliver quality user stories anyway. Okay, so this might be a bit fuzzy. So I brought you an example. I'm sorry this is not a real example because what we are working on is confidential and I could not bring it here, but this example I used on workshops where we collect risks together, and I brought the results of these workshops to you to see an example how this works in real life. You get the feeling. So the problem, the user story, is to have a split screen in Android. And I know there are some similar features already. Let's imagine that we need to implement this in our team. So what risks can you imagine in this story? This is our risk-based table. This might have some more columns if you want. This is the most basic version. So what could be the first risk? As we learned yesterday, the most important risk is the end of the universe. And then every other risk is irrelevant. The problem with that, it's not related to the story. So the first one is a real one, that the back button does not work in the correct application or does something else. This is just an example. Or the keyboard will be active in the wrong application. This can have really strange consequences. Or the zooming, if I use my fingers to zoom in and my finger goes into the other part of the screen, this might cause some trouble. Or sounds get mixed between the two applications, or battery goes dead too quickly. So these are some examples for risks. Of course, we can have much more. Usually for a normal user story, we have 40 or 50 risks. And then we can define the probability and damage of these risks together. This is usually done by a key developer and the testers, so not the whole team is there, just some experienced members. We use, you can use anything, colors or any numbers. We use a range from 1 to 5. And to avoid that, we are not using always 3. We are using a technique that we set first the story which has the lowest probability, and then the risk with the highest probability. So in this case, this could be the sound. It's probably tested well enough that I switch the applications. This has a low priority, and zooming, this will surely cause some issues. This is just gut feeling now. And the rest will go inside between these two numbers. With the damage, we use the same technique. When the sounds get mixed anyway, then it's not a big issue. We just need to stop one of them. But if I type my password in the wrong application, this can cause serious damage. So this can be a 5. And the rest goes between. So we already have a number where we can see the impact of these risks. So here we can see what risk can cause the most issues or most severe issues. And then it comes the interesting part, which can really help later defining the test cases, the test effectiveness. So here the most harder to test is the battery. So if it goes that too quickly, it's not easy to write an automated test for that, right? So that would be a 1, because it's hard to test. And the most easiest to test is the keyboard. It can be automated and checked, maybe. And the rest goes between. And then we have a priority for all the risks. If this helps you in your developer teams or in defining test cases, then you can use it. So here, for example, we can see that we need to focus on this story first, and of course later on others, but this has the most critical part. And we also see that we have a high impact risk which cannot be tested, so we have to handle it with different methods, maybe. In case of my brother, the risk was actually had a very low probability, but the damage was extremely high. And what's sad is in this story that the test effectiveness was also really high. So don't underestimate those risks, which are unlikely. And you can use risk-based testing and try it out in your product to make it better. But what is much more important, that take care of yourself and take care of your loved ones. Bring them to a medical screening, to have a health check, until it's not too late.
You have received a private message. I'm not going to display. Someone said sorry for the loss you had.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
We have 2 questions. The first one, I'm going to read it out. What do you think about the teams that consider a Scrum Master as a secondary role for a tester?
I think it's a bad idea. I really think. When we started 3 years ago with Scrum, did not recognize the importance of a Scrum Master or of a good Scrum Master, but we do now. So the Scrum Master is I won't say that the most important role in the team, but one of the most important role. So a good Scrum Master, without a good Scrum Master, it's really, really hard to get things done and to get things right. And I do not see how the Scrum Master should be involved in testing. The Scrum Master is like a team manager or something like that. It's should not be involved in the development or the testing parts of the product. I think this will lead to wrong directions.
Yeah, thank you. Final question. Could you tell us the typical duration of the phases in hours, roughly, I think?
Yeah, I suppose you are interested in the duration of these meetings because the phases are quite dynamic, right? So the phases, I cannot tell you an exact number for the phases. For the meetings, we set time limits because, of course, there is a danger behind this risk-based test meeting that we are going too deep and we are looking for risks which are quite irrelevant, and therefore it should be limited also. But it also has some dangers that we are not aware that there could be other risks which we did not find. So, of course, if we are not thinking on a risk, then this is still a risk. And if we do it time limited and we do not invite everyone from the team, then it takes not too much time. So I think it's worth still has more value than we are doing on the meetings.
Seems like we have another question. Are risks raised by system test department tested during the sprint or later by the system testers?
Of course, they are tested during the sprint, and not only tested, but they are considered during the development phase. So the risks raised by the system test are the same risk as any other, so they go into the table.
You have received a private message. I'm not going to display. Someone said sorry for the loss you had.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
We have two questions. The first one, I'm going to read it out. What do you think about the teams that consider a Scrum Master as a secondary role for a tester?
I think it's a bad idea. I really think. When we started 3 years ago with Scrum, we did not recognize the importance of a Scrum Master or of a good Scrum Master, but we do now. So the Scrum Master is I won't say that the most important role in the team, but one of the most important role. So a good Scrum Master, without a good Scrum Master, it's really, really hard to get things done and to get things right. And I do not see how the Scrum Master should be involved in testing. The Scrum Master is like a team manager or something like that. It's should not be involved in the development or the testing parts of the product. I think this will lead to wrong directions.
Yeah, thank you. Final question. Could you tell us the typical duration of the phases in hours, roughly, I think?
Yeah, I suppose you are interested in the duration of these meetings because the phases are quite dynamic, right? So the phases, I cannot tell you an exact number for the phases. For the meetings, we set time limits because, of course, there is a danger behind this risk-based test meeting that we are going too deep and we are looking for risks which are quite irrelevant, and therefore it should be limited also. But it also has some dangers that we are not aware that there could be other risks which we did not find. So, of course, if we are not thinking on a risk, then this is still a risk. And if we do it time limited and we do not invite everyone from the team, then it takes not too much time. So I think its word still has more value than it brings we are doing on the meetings.
Seems like we have another question. Are risks raised by system test department tested during the sprint or later by the system testers?
Of course, they are tested during the sprint, and not only tested, but they are considered during the development phase. So the risks raised by the system test are the same risk as any other, so they go into the table.